extraordinary strategic point that this is crucial to the Cold War, what we might call Cold War One, the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Why did the Soviets struggle to keep up? Because this looks like one of the fatal flaws of their entire project, that, as you describe it, all they can really do is copy. They can't at all innovate. And because they're copying the chips that they're able to steal, they never do more than lag behind. That seems like a pretty important part of the Cold War story, but I don't think I've ever really read about that anywhere, or at least it's never been much more than a footnote in most histories of the Cold War.
That was one of the key puzzles that actually set me off in writing this book. Why could the Soviet Union produce atomic weapons, shoot the first person into space, but not produce computing power? Hardly at all. And it turns out that it's not about science. The Soviets had lots of smart physicists and even won several Nobel Prizes in fields related to semiconductor engineering. It's not a question of knowledge. In fact, the Soviets not only had knowledge they produced at home, they had exchange students studying with William Shockley at Stanford as early as the late 1950s. Some of the earliest Soviet exchange students enrolled at Stanford to study semiconductor engineering. Sort of extraordinary. I wonder if the person who approved that application at the State Department knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
But it didn't matter. Nor did it matter that the Soviets had spies. Some of the defectors who were associated with the Rosenberg spy ring were electrical engineers, worked in the US defense industry during World War II, then defected to the Soviet Union to try to build the Soviet computer industry, and also completely failed. The Soviet Union knew it would take money to build the semiconductor industry and invested a lot of money. They knew it would take expertise, but they couldn't get outside of the mindset of copying. When one of the first Soviet exchange students came from the US back to the Soviet Union, he brought with him a chip from Texas Instruments, which at the time was one of the most advanced chips of its day. And he brought it to the minister who was in charge of microelectronics in the Soviet Union. And the minister took it in his office and pulled it under a microscope and looked at it. And he lifted his head up and said, "Copy it, 1 for 1, no deviations, I'll give you 3 months." And that was the mindset from the earliest days of the semiconductor industry. And copying was a fine strategy for an industry like atomic weapons, where there are actually very few advances in atomic weapons technology from 1945 to present. But in an industry that gallops forward at the rate of Moore's law, copying is a horrible strategy.
And there's a plan, and this is characteristic of the Soviet Union, to have an entire city dedicated to manufacturing chips. Zelenograd. Where was Zelenograd? Did they build Zelenograd?
They did indeed. It's still actually right outside of Moscow. And the Russian chip industry today, such as it is, very small, technologically backwards, is still located there.
Practically non-existent at this point. Yeah. So this is fascinating to me, because it seems to me that this is part of the story of the first Cold War that has been largely neglected, because the focus has been on the space race, above all the nuclear weapons race, and then all the kind of proxy wars that historians spend a lot of time looking at. But I mean, you won't find terribly much discussion of this in that enormous multi-volume history of the Cold War that was published not so long ago. So this is a really important contribution of Chip War. It makes you think again about why it was that the United States ultimately won Cold War I. It won it because it established leadership in this crucial frontier technology that required, and this is the question I have for you, it seems to me that it required commercialization to propel forward the innovation, to incentivize the US companies to keep pushing the frontier of Moore's law forward. And that could never happen in the Soviet system because there was never commercialization. You were just copying it, and that was it. Am I right that, in fact, it's the commercialization from the late 60s that keeps Moore's law happening?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And you couldn't, I don't think, have the type of innovation and the steady pace of innovation that you had in the chip industry in a socialist system for that exact reason. It's only the need for companies to compete in bringing out the next best chip to market that drives it forward. And if you look at where chips are going, the first couple of years of the chip industry in the 1960s, they mostly go into rockets, guidance computers for rockets. But by 1970, they're largely going to consumer devices. And by the 1980s, it's 95% going to consumer devices. So it really is the consumer industry driving forward innovation and also funding the extraordinary capital expenditure necessary to make this innovation possible at a large enough scale. So government funding remains important in the industry, but it's by far outplaced by consumer demand in terms of what's driving firms' capital expenditures by as early as the 1970s.